She said it was just clutter. My wedding dress. 43 years sealed in lavender paper, hidden inside the cedar chest my father gave me when I was 21. Just clutter. I can still hear her voice, the careless upward lift at the end, the way people talk when they think they are doing you a favor, when they think they know better about what should and shouldn't matter in your own life. My daughter Miriam had been staying with me for 3 months by then, moving in after her second divorce, though at first it was supposed to be just a few weeks while she figured things out. She came with suitcases and boxes and the tired tone of someone who believes they have endured the worst the world can throw at them, though in my mind there are many worse things than ending up in your mother's spare room with fresh linens and a pantry stocked for you. She had commandeered my kitchen table with her laptop and files, set up a tiny office in what used to be my sewing corner, and spread her scented candles and self-help books across the living room like the place had been waiting for her to bring it into the present. I didn't complain. I told myself it was temporary, that it was good to have company again, that maybe she and I might use this time to find some piece of each other that had been lost over the years. The cedar chest had sat in my bedroom under the window for decades, heavy enough that even when my knees were still good, I never moved it without help. I kept my wedding dress inside, carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue, the ivory silk still holding a faint whisper of the lavender sachets I tucked around it. I had made that dress myself in the summer of 1978, every seam basted and hand-finished, every inch of lace placed with my own fingers, working late at night in the small apartment I shared with Miriam's father before the wedding. I remembered the feel of the silk sliding under the presser foot of my singer, the hush of the fabric pooling on the floor, the weight of the skirt in my lap. It wasn't just a dress. It was the start of a story I thought would last forever. Even after the marriage ended, I couldn't throw it away. It was proof that I had once stood at the center of my own life, not at the edges of someone else's. That morning I had gone to my quilting circle, a small ritual that still gave my week some structure, and when I came home the chest was lighter. I didn't realize it right away. I put my keys on the counter, boiled water for tea, and went to open the chest for a piece of muslin I knew I had stored there. The top lifted easily, the tissue paper inside looked disturbed, the careful folds uneven. I dug through them with a growing sense of wrongness, the air catching in my throat. The dress wasn't there. In its place lay a small plastic packet of spring-scented drawer fresheners, the kind you buy at discount stores. They gave off a synthetic sweetness that made my eyes water, and for a long moment I just stared at them, willing myself to be mistaken. Miriam came in from the back porch, talking into her phone, one hand waving absently at me in a way that told me to wait until she finished her conversation. When she finally looked at me, I asked her where my wedding dress was. She blinked, her face smoothing into that expression she wears when she's about to make something sound reasonable. Oh, that old thing. I got rid of it. It was taking up space, and it's not like you were ever going to wear it again. She took a sip from her glass of mineral water and shrugged, as though we were talking about a pair of worn-out slippers. I told her it wasn't hers to throw away. She laughed lightly, the way she does when she thinks I'm being dramatic. It's just clutter, Mom. You have too much stuff. I'm helping you simplify. I didn't shout. I didn't even move for a moment. I just looked at her and wondered when she'd started speaking to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to know what mattered. I asked her where she'd put it, whether she had at least donated it to someone who might have used it. She said she'd put it out with the trash that morning, that the truck had already been by, that it was gone. The word hung there between us. Gone. And I realized it wasn't just the dress she had taken. She had reached into my past and decided which parts of it were worth keeping. I went back into my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the empty cedar chest. The lavender scent still lingered, stubborn and faint, and it made me think of the day I put the dress away after the divorce, folding it with deliberate care as if tucking my old life into a safe place until I could bear to look at it again. I thought of all the times I had opened that chest over the years, just to touch the fabric, the way it reminded me of a version of myself who had not yet been defined by loss, who had once believed in her own ability to make something beautiful from nothing. The absence of it now was like a missing tooth. My tongue kept going to the gap, disbelieving it could be empty. Miriam didn't knock before coming into the room. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and told me I was making too much of it. It's just a thing, Mom. Things don't matter. People matter. But the truth, which she didn't see or wouldn't see, was that the dress was a part of the person I had been, and she had discarded it without asking, without even telling me until it was too late to save it. I wanted to tell her that sometimes things matter, because they carry the memory of people who are gone, because they are a way of holding on to parts of ourselves that the years have worn thin. Instead, I said nothing. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I made tea, answered emails, folded laundry, all the while feeling the weight of the loss pressing down in a way that had nothing to do with fabric or storage space. It was a theft of something that could never be replaced, an erasure of a chapter in my life that had already been closed and locked away. In the evening, as I washed the dinner dishes, I caught Miriam watching me from the kitchen doorway. There was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read, annoyance, impatience, maybe even guilt. But she said nothing. I dried my hands, put the kettle on again, and told myself that there was no point in trying to make her understand. She had made her choice. And though I didn't yet know it, I was beginning to make mine. The moment I realized this wasn't just a careless mistake, but a deliberate act of dismissal, my heart sank deeper than I had imagined possible. It wasn't only the absence of the wedding dress that hurt. It was the way it was taken from me, vanished without warning or respect, as though my past, my history, my identity, were mere obstacles in the path of my daughter's reinvention of my home. That morning, after discovering the empty cedar chest, I sat quietly in the living room, turning the problem over in my mind, unwilling to confront Miriam just yet, hoping maybe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would restore the sense of balance between us. But the truth, cold and heavy, settled in like a stone sinking to the bottom of a still pond, where it would rest and ripple no more. Miriam's phone call earlier in the day had given me a hint of what was to come. I overheard her speaking in a clipped tone to someone I couldn't see. Something about clearing out the excess, reducing stress, and setting new boundaries. She had mentioned me by name, though I wasn't part of the conversation, and the words felt like they had been cast to sweep me aside. When she came back inside, there was an unfamiliar tightness in her smile, a steeliness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She sat down at the table and said, "Mom, I'm trying to help you. This house, all these things, you don't need them. You don't need to be weighed down by the past. Sometimes the best way to move forward is to let go." I looked at her, my throat tightening, and replied, "That dress was my beginning, Miriam." It was hope stitched in silk and lace. It mattered. She shrugged again, like I was a stubborn child clinging to toys long outgrown. "It's just fabric, Mom. It's not the person you are now." The finality in her voice made me realize that this wasn't just about the dress, or even about the house. It was about how she saw me, how she wanted the world to see me, as someone who no longer needed the memories and weight of the past, someone who could be reshaped and repurposed for convenience. Over the next few days, the tension between us thickened quietly, like fog rolling in from the harbor, smothering everything in its path. Miriam busied herself with reorganizing cupboards, labeling jars with dates and neat handwriting, clearing out drawers that had held my sewing kits and photographs, replacing them with exercise bands and vegan cookbooks. I watched from the edges of the kitchen, feeling less like a mother and more like a guest in a house that was still mine but no longer felt like home. When I tried to resist or protest, Miriam would smile in that way that didn't invite argument. "You're tired, Mom. You need rest, not clutter." She spoke as if she had the authority of a doctor delivering a diagnosis, or a judge delivering a sentence, and I had neither the energy nor the will to fight a battle I wasn't sure I could win. One evening, Miriam brought home a large plastic bin filled with photos and memorabilia she had rescued from the attic. She said she was making space for new memories, but as she dumped the contents on the dining table, I saw the careful omission of anything that connected me to my own youth or to Miriam's father. Old black and white portraits of my parents, snapshots of birthdays and Christmases long past, my own faded school photos, all left behind. Miriam sifted through the pile and tossed out anything that didn't fit her neat idea of the present, the future. I reached out to touch a yellowed photograph of Miriam as a child, sitting on my lap in a spring dress I had sewn myself. She snatched it away, her eyes sharp. "It's time to let go, Mom." That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the quiet only broken by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of the city. I thought about the years we had shared, the sacrifices I had made, the invisible labor that had gone unnoticed, the love I had given without expectation. I thought about how a person's worth can be so easily erased, not with shouts or blows, but with silence and disregard. I realized that Miriam wasn't just clearing out my things, she was clearing out my story, rewriting the narrative to exclude me. The thought settled over me like a cold wind through an open window. I wasn't sure yet how I would respond, but I knew one thing. I would no longer be invisible in my own life. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of the cedar chest again. This time, I reached inside the empty space where the dress had been and pulled out a small folded photograph I had hidden behind the tissue paper. It was a picture of me on my wedding day, smiling widely, wearing that dress with a confidence and hope that seemed distant now. I held the photo in my hands for a long time, tracing the lines of my face, the delicate lace on my sleeve. I whispered to myself, "I am still here." That night I gathered Miriam's 3 dusty bridesmaid dresses from the back of my closet. They hung limp and faded, relics of celebrations long past, each one a memory of a time when I had been present for her, when I had believed in the strength of family. My hands trembled only slightly as I folded the dresses carefully and placed them on my bed. The fire pit in the backyard was old and unused for years. I cleaned it out slowly over the next afternoon, removing ash and debris until the base was bare. When Miriam left for a weekend trip, I carried the dresses outside one by one and laid them gently on the coals. The flames caught the edges hesitantly at first, as if reluctant to consume what was once so full of life and meaning. The fabric curled and twisted. The scent of burning silk and cotton filled the air, a bitter, sharp aroma that clawed at my chest. I watched as the flames danced and swallowed the dresses, feeling a strange release as the past I had carried was transformed into smoke and ash. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel anger or triumph, just a steady, cold clarity that this was the moment I reclaimed the boundaries of my life. When Miriam returned, she noticed the empty closet immediately. She demanded to know where her dresses were, her voice sharp with disbelief. I looked at her calmly and said, "They are with my wedding dress." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, filled with words left unsaid and feelings too raw to name. Miriam called me unstable, accused me of being cruel, but I stood firm, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders with every breath. That night, for the first time in a long time, I locked my bedroom door. It was not an act of defiance or anger, but of protection, a way to hold space for myself, for the woman I was becoming. The days that followed were quiet but filled with a new kind of strength. I began to reassemble my home in a way that honored my memories rather than erased them. I placed my old teacups back on the shelves, hung the photographs I loved, and reopened the landline that Miriam had unplugged without asking. I wrote a letter to a friend I had lost touch with decades ago and signed up to teach a sewing class at the community center. Each small act was a stitch in the new quilt I was piecing together, a tapestry of resilience and self-respect that no one could unravel. And as I sat by the window, patching fabric from old curtains, I whispered to the empty room, "You don't erase history. You stitch it into something new." After the dresses were gone and the sharp clarity of that weekend's fire had settled into my bones, the house felt different. Not emptier, as I had feared, but strangely unfamiliar. Miriam's presence no longer felt temporary or guest-like. It was as if she was reshaping the very air I breathed, compressing the space around me until I could barely move. What began as small, helpful gestures soon morphed into a steady erosion of my routines, habits, and the sacred corners I had carved out over decades. It wasn't overt hostility. No shouting matches or harsh words filled the rooms. Instead, it was the quiet control that grows like ivy, creeping slowly but surely until it covers every wall, every window, blurring the light and trapping you in shadow. Mornings became a time I dreaded, not because I feared conflict, but because I woke with a sense of dislocation, as if the person I had been was already fading into the wallpaper. Miriam, in her perpetual rush to improve everything, had taken over the kitchen with new appliances that blinked and beeped in unfamiliar rhythms. She replaced my loose-leaf teas with pods for a machine I never learned to use, and swapped my delicate china for plain white mugs that felt cold and impersonal in my hands. I caught myself reaching for my favorite teacup, the one painted with blue forget-me-nots, only to see it tucked behind a stack of plastic containers. It was still there, but hidden, as though it had become an embarrassment rather than a treasure. She often commented on my old-fashioned ways, the gentle but relentless undertone that I was out of step with the world. When I brewed coffee the old way, ground beans, filtered water, the slow, mindful ritual of it, she would frown and say, "Why bother? This is faster and better." I tried to explain that it wasn't just about efficiency, it was about the pause, the moment of calm in a busy day, the connection to myself. She'd smile with that dismissive tilt of her head. "You're stuck in the past, Mom. It's time to move on." Her words weren't meant to hurt, but they did, slicing away at my confidence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Even the landline, once a lifeline to friends and neighbors, was not spared. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find the handset cradled on the counter, the cord cut and dangling like a broken thread. Miriam claimed it had been just an old nuisance, that no one used it anymore, but the gesture felt like a symbol, an erasure not only of communication, but of my place in a community I had nurtured for years. The silence it left behind was deafening, an empty room where voices once gathered. I found myself retreating to the quiet corners of the house, clutching onto the few things Miriam hadn't noticed or chosen to leave untouched. My sewing basket, the worn edges of my favorite armchair, the stacks of paperbacks on my bedside table. These relics were the last anchors in a shifting world that seemed determined to dissolve the person I was. Even my calendar, once filled with carefully marked appointments, birthdays, and notes in my neat handwriting, was replaced with Miriam's digital planner synced to her phone, a cold, sterile schedule that left no room for the small joys of spontaneity or reflection. The subtle invasions escalated further when Miriam began inviting her friends over, filling the house with unfamiliar faces and loud conversations that spilled late into the night. Their laughter, sharp and clipped, echoed off walls that once held only memories and soft silences. I found myself shrinking into the background, my presence overlooked, my stories untold. Once when I asked if I might join the conversation, I was met with polite smiles and quick subject changes, as if my voice were an interruption in their carefully curated gathering. The most painful moments were not the grand gestures, but the little erasures that accumulated like dust on old photographs. Miriam removed a framed picture of my late husband from the mantel, placing it face down in a drawer, saying it reminded her of sadness. She rearranged the bookshelves to hide volumes I treasured, replacing them with glossy magazines and cookbooks. For modern tastes, the house was becoming a gallery of her life, painted over the canvas of mine. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden tending to the rose bushes my husband had planted, Miriam came outside with her phone, snapping photos of the messy flower beds she said needed pruning. I watched as she spoke animatedly to someone on the phone, describing plans to hire a landscaper, dismissing my years of careful tending as amateurish and unnecessary. The garden, once my sanctuary, was now a project for renovation, something to be fixed rather than cherished. Yet beneath all this, I felt a quiet resistance growing. It was not loud or confrontational. It was a slow, steady reclaiming of the self I feared I was losing. I began to write again, filling notebooks with memories and reflections, sewing small quilts from scraps of fabric that Miriam had discarded. Each stitch was a whisper, a reminder to myself that my story was still mine to tell. One evening, Miriam suggested we sell some of my old furniture, claiming it would help declutter and make the space feel lighter. She didn't wait for my answer, making calls and arranging for a removal service while I was at a doctor's appointment. When I came home, the armchair where I had spent countless hours reading was gone, replaced by a sleek, minimalist piece that looked stylish but cold. I sat in it once and felt a pang of loss so sharp I nearly cried. The growing distance between us was never spoken aloud. There were no harsh words, no accusations, only a series of small betrayals wrapped in concern and help. Miriam was trying to build a new life, and in her mind, that meant leaving behind the old one, even if that meant leaving me behind as well. In those months, I learned the weight of invisibility, the quiet erosion of identity that happens when the people you love stop seeing you as you are. I felt the sting of exclusion not as a sudden wound, but as a persistent ache, a slow tightening around my spirit. Yet even as I felt myself shrinking, a part of me began to grow stronger, a part that knew this was not the end, but a beginning. I started to keep small journals hidden away, fragments of my thoughts and hopes written in the margins of old notebooks. I rediscovered the joy of small routines, like brewing tea just the way I liked it, listening to classical music late at night, and walking through the neighborhood early in the morning before the world had fully woken. These moments became my refuge, places where Miriam's presence could not reach me, where I could remember who I was beneath the layers of loss and change. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window and watch the street lamps flicker on one by one, feeling the weight of the day lift just enough to breathe. It was in those quiet hours that I made a promise to myself, not to fight the storm, but to learn how to weather it, to find the stillness inside the chaos. I knew the path ahead would be hard and uncertain, but I also knew that the first step was to hold on to my own truth, no matter how faint or fragile it seemed. The subtle control, the erasure of my voice in space, had become a test, a quiet, relentless pressure that forced me to look deeper at who I was and who I could become. I was no longer just a mother or a caretaker. I was a woman standing on the edge of a new chapter, one that I would write for myself, stitch by stitch, moment by moment. And so, in the face of gradual erasure, I began to rise. The turning point came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic confrontation, as many of the most profound moments in life often do. It was in the soft hours of early morning, when the world outside was still cloaked in mist and silence, that I found myself standing in front of the old cedar chest once more. The same chest where my wedding dress had lived for decades, and then disappeared in an instant. This time, though, I wasn't searching for what was lost. Instead, I was searching for what remained. The strength, the dignity, the parts of myself that no one could take away, no matter how hard they tried. I unfolded the small photograph I had hidden behind a drawer weeks earlier. The image of myself on that long-ago wedding day glowing softly in the pale dawn light. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to remember the woman I had been, before loss and disappointment shaped the contours of my life. The woman who had sewn that dress with love and hope and belief in forever. That morning, as the sun slowly lifted over the horizon, I gathered the 3 dusty bridesmaid dresses Miriam had left hanging in the back of the closet, each one heavy with faded memories and forgotten laughter. They were dresses I had never chosen, never wanted, but had worn out of love and obligation, symbols of a past life I had carried silently within me. Holding them in my hands, I felt a curious sense of calm settle over my chest, a quiet resolve that this was not an act of defiance or anger, but a reclaiming of boundaries long blurred by years of self-sacrifice. I did not tremble as I folded the fabric or hesitate as I carried the bundles outside. I laid them carefully on the cold coals of the fire pit in my backyard, the early morning air cool against my skin and heavy with the scent of dew and pine. The flames, small and tentative at first, began to catch the edges of the delicate fabric, curling the silk and lace into shapes that flickered and danced in the gentle breeze. The smell of burning cloth rose sharply, bitter and acrid, and I watched as the flames consumed the dresses one by one, the past turning to ash and smoke before my eyes. There was no spectacle, no angry words thrown into the fire, just a steady, quiet acceptance that this was a necessary cleansing, a release from the weight of expectations and memories that were no longer mine to bear. As the last ember faded, I felt a strange lightness settle over me, a lifting of invisible chains that had bound me to roles I no longer wished to play. In the days that followed, I began to notice the subtle shifts within myself, the ways in which I was beginning to step out of the shadows that had held me captive for so long. I started sewing again, not out of duty, but out of joy, piecing together scraps of fabric into small quilts that felt like declarations of my presence and resilience. Each stitch was a whisper of self-love, a quiet affirmation that I was worthy of care and attention. I reached out to old friends I had lost touch with, writing letters that carried pieces of my newfound voice and clarity. These simple acts, humble and unremarked upon, became the foundation of a new life taking shape beneath the surface of the everyday. The house, too, began to change, not through Miriam's interventions, but through my gentle insistence on reclaiming my space. I rearranged photos on the walls, bringing out the images that mattered to me, the faces of those I loved, and the moments that had shaped me. I brewed my tea the way I liked it, slow and careful, filling the kitchen with the familiar scents of jasmine and chamomile. I set my favorite chair by the window once more, placing a soft throw over its arm and a small stack of books within easy reach. These small gestures were acts of quiet rebellion against the erasure I had endured, signals to myself and the world that I was still here, still whole. One afternoon, I received a letter from an old friend inviting me to teach a sewing class at the local community center. The invitation felt like a lifeline, a chance to step back into the world on my own terms, to share the skills and stories I had gathered over a lifetime. I accepted without hesitation, the decision a beacon of hope in the growing dusk of my days. Preparing for the class, I found myself rifling through boxes of fabric and patterns, each piece a memory, a story waiting to be told. The process reminded me of who I was beneath the layers of disappointment and loss, a woman capable of creating beauty and connection in small, meaningful ways. At night I would sit by the window, patching quilts from old curtains and scraps left over from long-finished projects. The rhythmic motion of needle and thread soothed my restless thoughts, binding fragments of past and present into a tapestry of resilience. The house smelled faintly of lavender and cinnamon, the scent mingling with the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant hum of the city. In those moments, I whispered to the empty rooms, I am still here. I am still whole. It was not a cry for attention, nor a demand for recognition, but a quiet declaration to myself, a promise that I would no longer allow my story to be erased or rewritten without my consent. Miriam's presence in the house became less intrusive as I asserted my boundaries with calm but firm resolve. She noticed the changes, the quiet reclaiming of space and voice, but said little. The old pattern of control seemed to falter, replaced by a wary respect that acknowledged, without admitting, the shifting balance of power. I no longer waited for permission to live or to be seen. I moved forward with the slow certainty of someone who had found her footing after years of standing on shaky ground. This new chapter was not without its shadows. There were moments of doubt and loneliness, times when the weight of what had been lost pressed heavily upon my chest. But those moments were balanced by the growing lightness of freedom, the knowledge that I was no longer bound by the expectations or limitations imposed by others. I was writing a new story now, one stitched with threads of self-respect, quiet courage, and the gentle power of choosing myself again. The wedding dress was gone, the bridesmaid dresses were ashes in the fire pit, but the woman who had once worn them was alive and breathing, standing quietly in the soft morning light. And for the first time in many years, I felt the stirring of hope, not for a return to what was, but for the unfolding of what could be. The fragile calm I had begun to build was shattered one gray afternoon when a letter arrived, its envelope thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold and familiar. The scrawl of my daughter Miriam, though the words inside were colder than the chill that had settled over the sky that day. The letter was an intrusion into the quiet life I was trying to construct, a summons back into a world I had hoped to leave behind. As I unfolded the pages, I felt the weight of years of neglect and resentment pressed into every sentence. Miriam wrote of worry and frustration, but beneath the surface lay veiled threats and demands that I return to the role she had long assigned me, the obedient mother, the quiet keeper of the past. Her words accused me of being selfish, of abandoning the family at a time when we needed each other most. She painted a picture of chaos and heartbreak, the unraveling of what she called our life, and blamed me for every fracture and silence that had grown between us. The letter was not just a plea, it was a warning, an attempt to wrest control back into her hands. She spoke of next steps and intervention, and suggested that others were involved now, people who might question my judgment and capacity to live independently. The undercurrent was clear. She would not allow me to disappear without a fight, and she was prepared to use any means necessary to bring me back into the fold. Reading those words, I felt a swell of emotions: hurt, anger, sorrow, but most of all, a fierce determination not to be swept away again by the tides of other people's expectations. I folded the letter slowly and placed it on the kitchen table, its presence a dark stain on the pale linen. I knew then that the peaceful retreat I had carved out was about to be tested in ways I had not imagined. Miriam was not content to let go. She wanted to reclaim what she saw as hers, to reassert the hierarchy that had defined our relationship for too long. Shortly after the letter arrived, Miriam came to the house unexpectedly. Her face was pale, eyes sharp and searching, as if she were looking for cracks in the walls or evidence of a life lived without her approval. She spoke cautiously at first, offering tentative apologies for the upheaval, but the tone soon shifted to one of urgency and insistence. She told me that she had been speaking with my physician and social workers, that they were concerned about my well-being and suggested alternative living arrangements might be necessary. She framed her words as care, but I heard the steel beneath the softness, the pressure to comply, to yield to a future she had already chosen for me. I listened silently, the years of accumulated pain and quiet rebellion gathering in my chest like a storm. When she paused, I looked her in the eye and said, "I am not ready to give up my home or my life on your terms." This is my choice. The defiance in my voice surprised even me, but it was the truth. I was no longer willing to be the passive recipient of her decisions. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable, and then she left without another word. In the following weeks, the tension between us grew, simmering beneath polite exchanges and brief phone calls. Miriam's visits became less frequent but more charged, her presence a reminder of the world I had escaped but could not fully leave behind. She sent messages that veiled threats and concern, offered help that felt like control, and made promises that were quietly conditional. The emotional landscape of our relationship was shifting, a fragile dance between old wounds and new boundaries. One evening, a local social worker arrived unexpectedly, introducing herself as someone assigned to check in and assess my situation. She was polite but firm, asking questions about my daily routine, my health, and my support network. I answered honestly but cautiously, aware that every word might be weighed and judged. The visit felt intrusive, a crossing of a line I had hoped would remain private. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, the walls closing in with the weight of surveillance and suspicion. Yet even in the face of these pressures, I found allies in unexpected places. My neighbor Joyce, a sharp-witted woman with a no-nonsense attitude, offered quiet solidarity and practical support. She accompanied me to doctor's appointments, helped with errands, and became a steady presence in a time of uncertainty. Joyce's friendship was a balm to my spirit, reminding me that I was not as isolated as Miriam seemed to believe. Together, we navigated the complexities of the social services system and found ways to assert my autonomy in small but meaningful ways. The most challenging confrontation came when Miriam's lawyer called, a formal voice on the other end of the line, laying out legal options for guardianship and intervention. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but heavy with implication. I listened, refusing to respond until I had gathered my strength. Then, with deliberate calm, I told the lawyer that I was of sound mind and would not consent to any arrangements that diminished my independence. I had retained legal counsel of my own, and any further contact would be considered harassment. The silence that followed was profound, a quiet declaration that I was no longer the woman to be quietly sidelined. Throughout this storm, I held on to the small moments of grace and connection that sustained me. The gentle knock of Arthur, the widower who frequented the cafe where I worked mornings, brought warmth and companionship without pressure or pity. His kindness was a reminder that there were people in the world who saw me as whole, not broken. The letters from Kieran, my grandson, offered hope and tenderness, a thread of love unburdened by the conflicts of the past. These relationships became my lifelines, the steady anchors that kept me grounded as the tempest raged around me. Miriam's attempts to control and confine me intensified as she realized I would not bend easily. She arrived at the cafe one afternoon, her posture stiff and her eyes searching. She asked to speak privately, her voice low and wary. I agreed, and we sat across from each other in the quiet booth, the air thick with unspoken words. She confessed, almost in a whisper, that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she had been frightened and overwhelmed by her own struggles. She admitted that she wanted to protect me, even if her methods were misguided. I listened, my heart softening but my resolve firm. I told her that love did not look like erasure, that caring did not require domination. I spoke of boundaries and respect, of the need to recognize each other as separate and whole. Our conversation ended without resolution, but with a new understanding that the path forward would be complicated and uncertain. In the weeks that followed, Miriam's visits became less frequent, and the tension in our interactions eased slightly, replaced by a tentative respect that acknowledged the space I had carved out for myself. I continued to rebuild my life, piece by piece, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope that no letter or legal threat could unravel. The past still cast long shadows, and the wounds left by years of neglect and misunderstanding would take time to heal. But I had crossed a threshold, stepped out of the silence and invisibility that had defined my existence for too long. I was no longer willing to be anyone's shadow or secret. I was claiming my story, my voice, and my right to be seen and heard. And in that claim, I found a new kind of freedom, a freedom born not of forgetting or forgiving, but of choosing myself fiercely and without apology, every single day. The moment of reckoning came not with a shout or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet resolve that settled over me like a steady flame, unwavering and clear. It was a late afternoon in the early autumn when Miriam returned from her trip, her steps hesitating as she crossed the threshold of the house I had fought so hard to make mine once more. I was waiting in the living room, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and fading summer flowers, the last light filtering through the curtains and casting long shadows on the walls. There was a tension between us, the kind that fills a room when everything that has been left unsaid finally presses against the fragile surface of civility. She looked around with a flicker of surprise, as if seeing the house through new eyes. The photographs were back on the walls, the teacups returned to their places, the landline resting quietly on the side table. It was clear she hadn't expected this reclamation, this gentle but unmistakable reassertion of my presence. Her gaze finally landed on the empty closet where the bridesmaid dresses had once hung, the space now bare and silent. Without a word, she stepped closer and asked softly, almost hesitantly, "Where are my dresses?" I met her eyes without flinching, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders with the courage I had gathered piece by piece. "They are with my wedding dress," I said simply, my voice steady and calm, carrying a quiet power that needed no explanation. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, stretching between us like a bridge both fragile and unyielding. Miriam's face flickered through 1,000 emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned away abruptly, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she retreated into the guest room she had claimed as her own. For a moment, I sat there alone, the stillness settling around me like a shroud, and I felt a deep sense of peace wash over my heart. This was not a victory born of revenge or spite. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a boundary drawn firmly and without apology. The past could no longer be manipulated or discarded by others. I was the keeper of my story now, and it would be told on my terms. That night, as the house grew quiet and the shadows deepened, I locked the bedroom door for the first time since Miriam had moved in. The act was not one of defiance but of protection, a sanctuary where I could gather my strength and heal the fractures that years of neglect had carved into my soul. The lock clicked softly, a sound both final and freeing, sealing away the intrusion and marking the beginning of a new chapter. In the days that followed, Miriam's presence in the house became tentative, less assured. She sent messages asking if I was all right, invitations to talk that I declined with polite firmness. The lawyer's letters continued to arrive, formal and cold, but I responded with clear, measured words that left no room for misinterpretation. I was of sound mind, living safely, and not under duress. Any further attempts to intervene without my consent would be considered harassment. The power dynamic had shifted, and I was no longer willing to be sidelined or silenced. The community around me noticed the change, too. At the cafe where I worked mornings, Heather smiled knowingly and saved me a crossword puzzle page from the newspaper, a small gesture of inclusion and respect. Arthur, the widower who had become a steady companion, brought me a hand-painted magnet shaped like a birdhouse, a symbol of home and belonging. These simple acts reminded me that I was not alone and that new connections could be forged even in the aftermath of loss. One afternoon, Miriam appeared again, this time at the cafe, standing awkwardly by the pastry display. Her coat was too fine for the drizzle, her expression unreadable. I did not approach her. Instead, I finished my shift and let her wait. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant, asking if we could talk privately. I nodded and led her to the back booth, the air thick with unspoken memories and tentative hopes. She admitted that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she had been frightened and overwhelmed by her own struggles. She confessed that her attempts to control had come from a place of fear, a misguided effort to protect both of us. I listened, my heart softening, but my resolve unbroken. I told her that love was not control, and care was not erasure. We spoke of boundaries and respect, of the need to see each other as whole and separate beings. Though the conversation ended without resolution, it opened a door to a new understanding, fragile but real. In the quiet moments that followed, I continued to rebuild my life, stitch by stitch, moment by moment. I wrote letters to friends, reconnected with old allies, and embraced the small joys of a life lived on my own terms. The ashes of the past, including the dresses and the silenced memories, were transformed into the foundation of something new, stronger, wiser, and wholly mine. And as I sat by the window one evening, the soft glow of the setting sun bathing the room in amber light, I whispered to the empty house, to myself, and to the future yet to come. I am not undone. I am not forgotten. I am here. I am whole. The days that followed the confrontation brought with them a quietness that felt both fragile and profound, like the stillness after a storm has passed, and the world holds its breath before the first new leaf unfurls. I found myself settling into a rhythm that was unfamiliar but deeply nourishing, a rhythm of small, deliberate choices made in the soft light of morning and the hush of evening. The house, once a battleground of control and silence, began to feel like a sanctuary once more, filled not with conflict, but with possibility. I returned to old habits that had been long dormant, brewing tea just the way I liked it, tending the garden my husband had planted years ago, and carefully arranging the photographs that told the story of a life lived fully, not just endured. One afternoon, I received a letter from Kieran, my grandson, the one thread of connection that had never frayed. His handwriting was large and deliberate, the words simple but full of warmth and hope. He wrote that he was coming to visit, that he wanted to talk without the weight of the past pressing down on us. I read his letter by the kitchen window, the sunlight catching the edges of the paper and filling the room with a golden glow. The promise of his visit felt like a small beacon in the quiet unfolding of my new life, a reminder that healing was possible, even across years of distance and silence. Preparing for Kieran's arrival, I found myself dusting off old memories and hopes, setting the table with care and choosing a quilt to drape over the guest chair. I did not expect miracles, only the gentle unfolding of connection, the possibility of a new beginning written not in grand gestures, but in shared moments and honest conversation. When he arrived, taller and quieter than I remembered, we embraced with a tenderness that spoke of forgiveness and understanding without needing words to define it. We sat side by side in the modest guest room, the quiet between us filled with the soft hum of the city beyond the window. Our conversation was gentle and unhurried. Kieran told me about his life, his work at the bookstore, the small triumphs and struggles of adulthood, and I shared fragments of my journey, the quiet rebellions and steady rebuildings that had brought me to this moment. There were no accusations or regrets, only the soft weaving together of two lives that had once drifted apart, but were now beginning to find their way back to each other. Before he left, he gave me a small book of poems, underlining the verses that reminded him of me. I read them that night by lamplight, the words settling like a balm over my heart and whispering truths I had almost forgotten, that women rise not from fire alone, but from the courage to remember who they are despite what others have said or done. Life continued in its gentle unfolding. I returned to the cafe where I worked, greeting regulars with a smile that was no longer forced but born of genuine connection. Arthur remained a steady presence, his quiet companionship a reminder that kindness need not be loud to be profound. Joyce, my neighbor, became more than a friend. A partner in this new chapter of life filled with potlucks, trivia nights, and shared stories over cups of tea. Together we celebrated small victories and weathered the inevitable challenges, finding joy in the simple pleasures of community and belonging. One evening, as autumn deepened and the air grew crisp with the promise of change, Joyce and I sat on the porch wrapped in quilts, watching the moon rise over the quiet street. We toasted with lukewarm tea, laughter spilling softly into the night. It was a celebration not of grand events, but of survival and renewal, a recognition that the loudest triumphs are often the quietest. In that moment, I understood that I had not just rebuilt my life. I had transformed it, stitching together the fragments of past pain and present hope into a tapestry that was uniquely mine. The letters from Miriam slowed and eventually stopped, the attempts to control and reclaim fading into silence. I did not seek reconciliation, nor did I close the door completely. Instead, I chose peace on my own terms, a peace that embraced boundaries and honored the hard-won lessons of self-respect. The house, once a place of conflict, became a home once again, filled with memories that no one could take away, and with a future that I would shape with my own hands. And so, as the seasons turned and the years moved forward, I sat by the window, the light shifting softly across the room, and I whispered to myself a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. I am not lost. I am not forgotten. I am here. I am enough. For any woman who finds herself standing at the edge of silence and invisibility, wondering if she still matters, I offer this. You are your own sign. You are the quiet noise that breaks through the dark. You are the step away from waiting for permission to live your own life. And when you choose yourself truly and fiercely, you open the door to a life that is not defined by what was taken, but by what you dare to build anew. If this story has found you at the right moment, if it has stirred something deep within, I invite you to share it, to let another woman know that it is never too late to reclaim her voice, her space, her story. Because in the end, the greatest act of courage is simply to choose yourself again and again, no matter how many times you have been told you should not.